disrupt anybody that's watching virtually. And so I'd like to welcome Claire Chambers, who's going to talk to us today about sexual misery or happy British Muslims. And so I'll hand over to Claire. You have 20 minutes, and then we will do all of the presentations with collective questions afterwards, if that's okay. So thanks, Claire.
So I'd like to thank AKU for a really fascinating conference so far, and I also have to thank the project I'm involved in, which is called Story and Relationships. It's a new AHRC project, started in May, and my principal investigator on this project is Richard Phillips at University of Sheffield, and I also want to thank Nafisa Ali, Peter Hopkins and Raksha Pandey, with whom I work on this project, and the research is coming out of that. So I begin this paper with a close look at some contemporary pictures of sexual life in the Muslim world that have been painted in certain sections of the Western media, asking how and why these pictures matter. Across a range of mainstream print media, from the New York Times to the Daily Mail, and across reported events from several countries, can be found depictions of sexual misery, framing Muslim men as tyrannical and the wider world of Islam as culpable. Crucially, this is not the whole story. I then consider how these negative representations are being challenged and how they can be contested further. In doing so, I shall not simply set pictures of, quote, sexual misery against their binary opposites, namely pictures of sexual happiness and liberation. Instead, I will search for a more complicated picture, one that challenges stereotypes about the sexual lives of Muslims without simply idealising its subjects. This takes us to the journalism, life writing and non-fiction of Shalina Zahra Muhammad, because I should probably make clear from the outset that I'm not a media expert. I instead, really what I do is literature, although from quite an interdisciplinary perspective. So I do feel quite comfortable close reading the media, but my first love is fiction, poetry, film and so forth. Writing in the New York Times in February 2016, the French-Algerian writer Kamel Daoud painted a picture of sexual misery in the Arab world. His article, like many others published in the wake of the sexual attacks which took place in Cologne, Hamburg and Stuttgart a month earlier, slipped easily and lazily between a number of terms: refugee, Arab and Muslim. Daoud links the actions of a number of individuals to the culture and religion of much larger groups, beginning with 1 million or so refugees who had arrived in Germany in the recent past, extending to the Arab world, other peoples and cultures of North Africa and the Middle East, and to the Islamic world more broadly. These, quote, miserable peoples are set against an equally stereotypical West, which is assumed to be a place of gender equality and mutual respect. All this seems very familiar, the latest iteration of stereotypes and sometimes willful confusions that can be traced through European colonial histories. That said, this sexualised and moralised discourse of difference has shifted over time, and it has been mapped onto new developments and events. Daoud's piece is really the latest instalment from a subgenre of journalism in which current events with broadly sexual content are reported and interpreted against a common backdrop, or, as Edward Said puts it, an imaginative geography. On this backdrop is sketched a jumbled picture of the Arab and Islamic worlds, which centres on North Africa and the Middle East, but spills over into other places where Arab and or Muslim men come into contact with others. Such an imaginative geography exists primarily in the European mind, but it is mapped onto real people and places, forming the lens through which these events are interpreted. This is a place of sexual misery in which tyrannical men objectify and exploit women and girls, both within and without their own communities. As I've indicated in Kamel Daoud's article, as in a number of other media reports and commentaries on the sexual assaults in Germany, a composite category is created of the sexually rapacious refugee, Arab and Muslim man. The actions of relatively few individuals are identified with this increasingly capacious and allegedly predatory group. Each of the subcategories matter, but one stands out above all as the usual suspect in this burgeoning genre of current affairs reporting, the Muslim man. A group of academics, including David Theo Goldberg, Ghassan Had, and Laleh Khalili, who published an open letter protesting Daw's psychologization of more than 1 billion individuals from Muslim backgrounds. Developing this line of argument, I shall now consider another news event in which the actions of another small group of people, in this case British men with Pakistani heritage, were identified with a series of increasingly generic categories and communities. Once again, the buck stopped with Muslims, a large community held responsible for the actions of a few. Writing as a Muslim in the Daily Mail in November 2012, Yasmin Alibi Brown commented on the most recent of a series of sexual abuse stories which involved organised gangs in northern England. In keeping with the shrill and combative tone of the Daily Mail, she dramatised the situation and identified an enemy. Circles of sexual hell for young girls are run by gangs of Muslim men, most of Pakistani or Bangladeshi heritage, who mostly prey on white girls, she claimed. Alibi Brown was commenting on a recent report by the Deputy Children Commissioner for England, Sue Barawitz, which investigated the sexual exploitation of girls by organised gangs. Like journalists in some other newspapers such as The Times, Alibi Brown argued that Barawitz had fudged the real issue in sexual abuse. Alibi Brown accused the Deputy Commissioner of failing to name and blame those who, as she said, were disproportionately responsible, Muslim men of Pakistani Asian heritage. Alibi Brown alleged that this official was held back by political correctness and fear of coming across as racist. The contested coverage of this report illustrates a pattern that is replicated across a number of news stories on similar themes. These include reporting of the J Report, 2014, which revealed that at least 1,400 children were abused in Rotherham between 1997 and 2013. The ongoing National Crime Agency, NCA, investigation of grooming and sexual exploitation in the same region, and analysis of individual cases and convictions. The Guardian gave Barawitz space to make her case that the sexual abuse she investigated was, quote, not a problem within one particular faith or ethnic group. She explained that the ethnicity of abusers and victims alike mirrored those of the communities in which the events took place, and observed that the majority of the abusers were in any case white. That message has been echoed in subsequent articles in The Guardian. For example, the newspaper covered the conviction of 6 men in Rotherham in 2016 by listing a series of contrasting cases which included a variety of perpetrators and victims. This listing technique cumulatively contradicted any simplistic picture of Asian or Muslim men exploiting white girls. Reporting for the BBC's File on 4, Manveen Rana exposed the fact that Asian women were victims in Rotherham too, but that their voices had been silenced. Still, as they often do, many of the most prominent British newspapers ignored the complexities of the case, instead naming the, quote, elephant in the room, as The Times put it. Elephants are, of course, large, obvious things, but the guilty party was not so easily apparent in this case. On the contrary, his identity slipped between a number of categories. At one point, The Times accused Muslim men, mostly of Pakistani origin, effectively attaching the blame to Muslims and on religion. At another moment, this short comment piece refers to Pakistani origin men, creates the impression of attributing the problem to Pakistan and to migrants from that country. Another article in The Times quotes Michael Gove as complaining about the report's silence on, quote, Asian abusers. In all these stories, various types of people are mentioned, and just as in the coverage of the sexual assaults in Germany, these figures cohere, with ethnic, geographical, cultural and religious categories blurring into one another. Perhaps out of fear of repeating any given term more than once, but more likely out of confusion about the allegations that are being made and the differences between the terms, a number of categories are conflated. Out of this confusing picture, the category of Muslim floats to the surface and links these particular events to others in different and distant parts of the world. And yet, like other stereotypes, this figure has sometimes also been disputed. Countering the pervasive pictures of misery described, more positive pictures of Muslim sexualities are being put forward. To begin with, the mainstream media, the Herald Scotland, BBC and Guardian have all printed stories about speed dating and modern matchmaking, which depict Muslims in a more positive light and as fully human figures. These articles subvert traditional ideals of marriage and Muslim relationship practices. Within such stories, young British Muslim men and women openly break down stereotypes of the traditional Muslim and instead reveal a glimpse of the real-life experiences of the everyday Muslim, who could be the assumed white reader's Muslim neighbour, colleague and or friend. The Guardian's article, Single Muslim Women on Dating, I Don't Want to Be the Submissive Wife, features Esma, who is said to be a modern Muslim with an age-old dilemma. Similarly, Nabila Jamil, an emerging author of Pakistani heritage, wrote a humorous chapter on speed dating entitled The Marriage Event for her forthcoming novel about the intractable difficulties experienced by a divorced woman looking for love in the British Muslim context. On entering a large room set up for the purposes of matchmaking, Jamil's protagonist, Sarah, thinks the room was like a tin full of quality streets with a very few purple ones. As a single Muslim woman looking for love, both Esma and Sarah and their stories highlight the challenges faced by ordinary Muslim women. These challenges often turn out not to be so different from those of any other single woman looking for love, irrespective of religion or culture. Working alongside and sometimes within the mainstream media, a new wave of young Muslims are also finding ways to present their friends, families and communities as confident, contented people who can enjoy life and conduct well-rounded relationships. For example, in 2014, a YouTube video entitled Happy British Muslims was disseminated by an incognito group of British Muslims known as Honesty Policy as a tribute to the African-American songwriter Pharrell Williams. Happy British Muslims quickly went viral as a joyous antidote to the dominant narrative of sick Muslim sexuality. The video has already garnered over 2,300,000 views and many inches of newsprint. I'll just play you a little bit, I think. If I can. We've got sound.
I don't think so.
Okay.
It might seem crazy what I'm about to say. Sometimes she's here, you can take a break. Hot air balloon at the ghost face. With the air, like I don't care, baby, by the way. Because I'm happy, I'm alone. If you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy, I'm alone. If you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Because I'm happy, I'm alone. Happiness is.
Okay, so I just wanted to show you that record scratch moment in particular. As you see, it features men, women and children from various ethnic groups dancing, even lollipopping to Williams' hit song Happy. Some of the women are wearing hijab, some are not. There were Guy Fawkes masks, abayas, shalwar kameez, jeans, children's fancy dress costumes. It's the ordinariness of the video set against its upbeat soundtrack that is affecting and effective. Quintessentially British settings such as skateboard parks, suburban living rooms, a greasy spoon cafe, council estates, dreaming spires, a mosque, fountains and a meadow form the backdrop to the video. But as I say, two record scratch moments briefly pierce the exuberant optimism. Firstly, as you saw, Cambridge scholar Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, also known by his birth name of Tim Winter, and renowned for his seriousness, stares impassively at the camera before holding up an explanatory "I'm happy" sign. Later in the song, another discomforting instance quickly passes when two Muslim men seem to square up to each other, but then jive together to Williams' catchy vocals. There was some limited criticism of the video as haram, and this judgment that it was not permissible for believing Muslims had a sexual angle because Muslim music and dancing are seen as, in some circles, as gateways to impropriety. However, the primary critic, the Sharam Post, quickly deleted that article stating that Sheikh Murad had distanced himself from the video when he contradicted this by speaking to The Independent in favour of Honesty Policy's video. Happiness is not what is expected of British and other Muslims who are too often seen as dour and sexually repressed. There is an adversarial quality to the stories I've discussed here. The negative stereotypes of miserable Muslims, personified in the figure of the tyrannical Muslim man who preys on white girls and women while his wife and sisters fester at home, is countered by pictures of happy and sexually liberated Muslims. Arguably, each of these pictures is simplistic, one dwelling on problems that have some substance but are exaggerated and wildly distorted, the other glossing over tensions and challenges in its effort to present a more positive picture of the sexual lives of Muslims. The latter, however well-meaning, idealises Muslims, potentially dehumanising them. And I want to credit my co-supervised PhD student Iman Nafati, who wrote a brilliant blog piece about the Kamran Dawud article, in which she contends that Muslims are too often portrayed as, quote, angelic and innocent, particularly by leftist writers. Nafati defends Dawud in the face of such angelism, portraying him as a North African Muslim scholar criticising Islam from the inside. And yet, as I have argued, Dawud goes too far in his attempt to face up to the problems, however real, that led to the sexual attacks in Cologne. In the face of such stereotypes and counter-stereotype, hard criticism and pulled punches, something more balanced is needed. This, I suggest, cannot be found in adversarial or sensational writing, or in an absorption of horrific and extreme events. A more variegated picture of the sexual lives of Muslims may be found in stories told by, rather than about, the people who are involved. It can, of course, be problematic to find someone who identifies as a Muslim in his or her life and work, and we should be suspicious of authenticity claims like those proclaimed by Yasmin Ali Brown in the Daily Mail article. But I want to conclude by talking a little bit about someone I think is capable of speaking through a particular Muslim experience, but does not claim to speak for all Muslims, and as a writer whose work ranges across journalism and more literary forms. So Shalina Zahra Jan Muhammad is of East African Asian heritage, who wears hijab, is quite religious, and she's written some really interesting pieces. In 2013, she wrote an article for The Telegraph entitled "What Muslim Women Really Want in the Bedroom." According to Islamic teaching, sex is supposed to be between a married couple, but within that prescription she shows there's quite a lot of leeway. She interviews the CEO of Al Azira, an online shop selling a range of halal sensual unguents and candles. Another respondent is an Irish Muslim convert who runs a course to teach innocent Muslim women about their sexual rights. A famous incident is recorded in this article from the Sunnah, describing the Prophet Muhammad's rebuke to an overly pious husband for neglecting his wife in the bedroom. Jan Muhammad also recounts the teaching that Allah gave 9 parts of desire to women and only 1 to men. In this article, Jan Muhammad states that Islam has always been extremely open about sexual pleasure, and in particular women's pleasure. This theme also runs through her first book, Love in a Headscarf, which was published in 2009. It's a memoir, a bildungsroman, a work of chick lit, and a self-help book. The book's narrative arc is shaped by the author's search for a suitable husband. Love in a Headscarf has touches the genres to which it is indebted. It has more than a touch of Bridget Jones for the protagonist, but it is significantly different, exploring relationships through a particular Muslim-identified perspective. For example, the story departs from the individualistic underpinnings of other works in this genre. My marriage, declares Jan Muhammad, was a collective experience. The book provides a stimulating account of a resilient Muslim feminist who sees herself as part of the Ummah while refusing to fit into other people's boxes. Like Nabila Jamil, Jan Muhammad includes a chapter on speed dating in Love in a Headscarf. Whereas Jamil's rendition of the practice was satirical, Jan Muhammad's comes towards the end of her book when the narrator's almost given up on finding her husband, and the tone is thus ruefully reflective. She attends 2 speed dating events designed specifically to connect single Muslims. The first makes Jan Muhammad uncomfortable because it's held in a nightclub cum bar and she is a teetotaler. The second one is more well organised. She has higher hopes for it because there's a vetting process, but she finds that there's hardly any men. There's a few of them have been paid to be there, and those that are genuinely looking for a wife are only interested in the ones who are dressed up in full Bollywood glamour. So at the end of that chapter, the whirling tables of the speed dating event sort of dissolve into the crowds circulating around the sacred Kaaba at Mecca on her subsequent Hajj pilgrimage. And so she is making a spiritual point that positions love as communitarian rather than an individual pursuit. In Generation M, Young Muslims Changing the World, her most recent book, 2016, is a work of non-fiction, and Jan Mohammed develops some themes related to relationships and sexuality, while painting pictures of young Muslims, whom she calls Generation M, as a digitally connected, creative and enterprising faith group. A central concern is to contest the stereotype of the downtrodden Muslim woman. Without denying that some Muslim women face oppression, she depicts a group of British Muslim females who have full agency. These women use playful words like hijab-alicious and mixer to describe themselves, their clothing and the businesses they set up to market their cool but pious lifestyles. All this is summed up in a tweet that Jan Mohammed uses as a chapter heading: "Forgot to be oppressed, too busy being awesome." So I'll wrap up completely and just say, where do we go from here? I think we've seen that sexual and relationship life can be both joyous and difficult. I'm making 3 proposals: the need for more stories, more work like Jan Mohammed's. I had a critique of Jan Mohammed that there is no time for. So I'm not telling it was a perfect model, but I think this kind of the expanse she has to talk about this is really important. I think critics like me need to be more imaginative in who we seek out, and I think we need to pay greater attention to audiences. There's a theme that's been coming up quite a lot today, and there's the project AHLC Story Relationships if you want to find out more.
Thank you, Claire. Now I'd like to invite Burak to come and present his piece on religious identity and TV audience interpretation. Thank you.
I thought that you were having the control over them.
It's a self-help shop here.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Actually, this is a part of a bigger project that I'm currently working on, funded by TÜBİTAK, Scientific and Technological Research Council of Turkey. I would like to thank them for their support that they've given to this project. This is a really, really huge project, as I said. We're currently working on it. There's a field of TV production in Turkey, Islamic television channels, in-depth interviews and audience ethnography, and survey with more than 4,200 people. This is population representing the whole Turkish population. Actually, a survey for finding out who is watching what, and fuzzy cognitive mapping. This is just the introduction note. This is the blog that we are currently keeping for making the updates regarding the project. Yeah, I'm just passing these ones. There will be no about that. Yeah, just starting now. History of broadcasting is relatively new in Turkey. For many, many years it was under the state monopoly. It launched in 1968. Television stayed for many decades as the official voice of the state. The state monopoly over broadcasting has come to an effective end in 1991. After the entrance of first commercial channel, a series of ventures appeared. In 1994, just in 3 years, there were 11 national, 360 local or regional television channels and more than 1,500 radio stations in Turkey. It was 1993 when the first Islamic channel, TGRT, Turkey Newspaper and Radio Television, was formed, and this was followed by STV, the channel of the Gülenists, Channel 7 and Mesaj TV. Some of these channels were supported by political parties and some by religious orders, such as Qadiris or Nurus. But all pointed to one important fact: increased public visibility, legitimacy and popularity of Islam in Turkey. However, Islamic broadcasting was not an unproblematic issue for the Islamists at all. Legitimacy of radio and television to spread the Islamic message was already being debated and discussed by several Islamist circles. I will focus on 2 prominent Islamist intellectuals who wrote on the subject matter and epitomized the debates of the periods. One is Sadık Yansız Uçarlar and the other is Naci Bostancı. These are the books, just to note over there. These 2 figures are at the same time so important figures who played an active role in making of Islamic broadcasting in Turkey. Both authors criticized the modernized Muslims for trying to make distinctions between good technology and bad technology, or technology and culture. So for them, television was not a neutral apparatus which could be used for good or bad. All technologies, including television, will impose its cultural essence and its unique characteristics to wherever they go. Accordingly, television would bring a new look, perspective and rhythm to the cultural context it is inserted in. Television, for Yalsız Uçarlar, is an instrument providing illusions and imaginations to a community who loves its wisdom. Both perspectives, in fact, surprisingly, follow Neil Postman's critique in Amusing Ourselves to Death, which accuses television for destroying the typographic society and draining the public discourse. Both authors underline the threat posed by television as a form. So, rather than its content, they emphasize the role played by television in transformation of religious knowledge, religious consciousness, and authority. They criticize television for being an unfocused and dramatic medium. Both characteristics stand as the most important impediments to reaching the divine truth. Bostancı stated that the fragmented structure of television imposes a fragmented version of reality and on the audiences. Before a religious program, you watch a quiz show, and then entertainment program, and then you go back to a religious show again. What we experience here is not realization of the religiosity of life as a whole, but rather a fragmented form of existence in which only some small compartments of life is being religionized. For the Islamist intellectuals of the period of the early 1990s, the distinctive trait of television is its popularization and tabloidization of issues through divorcing them from its intellectual background and tying to non-critical fragments. Watching television required becoming a member of its epistemic community. Abdurrahman Arslan, a harsh critic of modernity and modernized Islam, shares the same concerns. For Arslan, television was not an invention of the Muslims, and it is too late for Muslims to define its functions or content. The only thing a Muslim can do is to consume it, but consume it under the conditions set by the Western culture and civilization. The biggest mistake of Muslims, according to Aslan, is Islamizing and consuming the things produced by others. When asked about Islamic broadcasting, his response was like that. Just making quotation. Islamic radio and television is not about airing or not airing hymns or music. You can stupefy people by reciting Quran all the day. Muslims miss a point, and they miss it for over 3 centuries. Focusing on the religious message, we do not question the medium itself. In my opinion, the Muslims cannot use this medium to deliver their message. As McLuhan argued, medium is the message. You cannot supplement a new message to that. It's like reinventing the wheel. End of quote. For devout Muslims of the period, for many years, watching and enjoying television was a matter of guilty consciousness. Not watching TV for the audiences was a matter of moral superiority. At many pious households who did not have TV sets, there were banners and stickers writing, "I did not watch television and did not lose anything. You watched it. What was your gain?" The first Islamic channel, TGRT, came with the slogan, "There will be peace on the screens." The long-forgotten national and moral values of the community were to be restored. The channel was claiming to overcome the inferiority complex imposed by secular television channels. They were posing oppositions between Western and the authentic, information and entertainment, quality and popularity, deep and shallow. A columnist from Gulen's community's Voice Zaman were stating that TGRT will set an example to other TV channels and help transformation of television field in Turkey as a whole. Now that TGRT is broadcasting, I'm making the quote from that newspaper columnist, now that TGRT is broadcasting, other channels will see that it will be possible to attract people's attention by giving importance to their morals and values. There is no doubt that Turkish people will embrace this new channel immediately. However, end of quote, however, it seemed that people were not that much waiting for TGRT and other Islamic channels. Islamic broadcasting immediately faced its fiercest dilemma: how to attract audience attention without hurting the mission. In one of the interviews, a former executive stated that the history of Islamic broadcasting is nothing but a series of compromises. At the beginning, he says, we were even discussing whether women's voice should be heard on TV. Then we started to discuss whether women should be seen on TV. In a couple of months, we have realized that TV broadcasting would be impossible with those concerns in mind. End of quote. One solution to that dilemma was airing Hollywood movies of 1950s and 60s with more conservative portrayal of men and women relations. The other was airing famous Kemal Sunal movies appealing the taste of newly urbanized masses. As early as in 1993, just a couple of months after the foundation of TGRT, an audience letter was published in Zaman newspaper. The letter was saying, by the time we have seen that TGRT is not that different from other secular channels. The viewer was criticizing TGRT for its low quality, shallowness, and search for popularity. With TGRT's New Year's Eve entertainment program in the same year, this time the complaints were heard even in Turkey newspaper, which was the newspaper of the broadcasting company itself. Things got more complicated with the foundation of the Turkish Radio Television Regulatory Agency. It banned paid lines and phone marketing, which meant a great financial blow to TGRT and other Islamic channels. Each and every move and market forces pushed Islamic channels to the mainstream. TGRT started airing pop music videos. Complaints were increasing. A columnist from Turkey newspaper were writing, in our religion there is no place for music, not even for Sufi music. Music nurtures the evil inside us and it is the poison for our souls. Music entertains us, tempts us sexually and makes us forget praying. End of quote. In 1994, just after 1 year foundation of the TGRT, the channel made a deal with popular female singer Seda Sayan, which was followed by other popular and highly secular figures. The TV flow has considerably changed with increased wave of entertainment programs including Turkish comedies, Hollywood movies, travel shows, gourmet TV shows, matchmaking shows, cartoons, fashion shows, and of course telenovelas. In an interview, one of the founders of Kanal 7, Ayşe Böhürler, she is also one of the founders of Justice and Development Party, thought that now it's all about business and money. However, the quick transformation and mainstreaming of Islamic broadcasting did not take place in a vacuum. Market Islam, as quoted by Patrick Henry, was the dominant force determining the fate of Islam's political, economic, and cultural universe. It was an era in which the logic of capital imposed its character on every inch of life, and in which the socio-economic class composition of Islamism began to change considerably. This was epitomized by the rise of Homo Islamicus, or an Islamic bourgeoisie. The market Islam is characterized by the ambition to generate Islamic version of everything. An Islamic essence is blown into various popular cultural formats, which ended up neither with unproblematic Islamization of these forms or full materialization of Islam per se. In other words, materialization and marketization of Islam implied convergence of secularization and Islamization at one and the same moment, giving birth to hybrid formats and identities. This is what makes Islam's turn of 21st century somewhat complicated and paradoxical. The rise of Islamism and Islamic media forced mainstream, more secular media initiatives to politically and culturally recognize the currency of conservative themes and concerns. Governmental regulatory agency Rhetoric, as a watchdog, strictly monitored the so-called immoral representations which disregarded national or moral sensitivities of Muslim society, such as obscenity, premarital sex, homosexual relations, or bad representations of religious figures. Since the media sector is characterized with economic reliance of media conglomerates on state, the secular media outlets could not ignore neither societies nor government sensitivities. Islamic symbols, figures, characters, themes started to show up in series and other TV shows. Among many other records, Justice and Development Party had a persistent and systematic ambition to design the media sphere in Turkey. Islamic broadcasting companies and Islamic media today has become the partisan agencies of political and cultural conservatism of Justice and Development Party. And the tying knot in this equation is a pan-Ottomanist and pan-Islamist domestic and foreign policy, which is strictly in line with the neoliberal authoritarian trajectory of Justice and Development Party. Islamic broadcasting today became a terrain on which the Islamist conservative biopolitical agenda is set, political scores are settled, new communities were forged, and history is negotiated. When we come to the audience part of the story, in their social critique of judgment of taste, Bourdieusian studies underline the importance of distinctions, hierarchies, and differentiations made by people. Michel Lamont, for instance, stressed the importance of drawing symbolic and moral boundaries in making of social relations. For her, symbolic boundaries are conceptual distinctions made by social actors to categorize objects, people, practices, and even time and space. In our study, we have seen that in television consumption, morality becomes the yardstick against which viewing choices and practices were ordered and justified. We are still waiting for the data of the survey that I'm talking about. Now we are in the field, and at the end of this month, most probably the survey will end. But for the moment, suffice it to say that the religious conservative audience frequently interacts with television alongside with moral rather than aesthetic dichotomies such as moral and immoral, authentic and alien, appropriate, inappropriate, ours, theirs, deep, shallow, and so on. More importantly, they do this with a claim of moral and sometimes political superiority. For instance, a 40 years old GDP, AKP member Orhan, a male, who defines himself as a devoted Islamist and follower of Erdogan, stresses his television choices as an instrument to cause a strict divide between himself and others. The others, according to Orhan, are implicitly the rest of the population who do not vote for GDP. He considers television as a waste of time and feels guilty for watching it. He argues that when watching TV, he must feel learning something. He must see confirmation of his values and position, his worldview. This is why he stresses the news programs, discussion programs, documentaries, and recently popular and highly politicized costume dramas and political series. However, Orhan is at the same time worried about his family's media consumption patterns. He looks down at his wife's viewing choices and accuses her watching rubbish such as women's television programs, telenovelas, and popular game shows. For Orhan, his children's internet and social media using habits are worrying also. We have some similar cases like that. I'm going to pass that. But we should not come up with easy conclusions by posing a clear-cut distinction between the so-called religious conservative and secular viewing choices. Our other field findings also showed us that these cases above can be considered as exceptions. In other words, we do not have two distinct cultural worlds with different isolated cultural tastes. Rather, what we come across is an endless combination of hybrid forms, articulations, and associations. So, audience groups are not hygienically separated alongside some religious, ideological, or political lines. Rather, audience are dynamic products of constellations of choices and audience practices. In several meetings, we came across with television viewers watching both secular and more religious contents and giftedly justifying and legitimizing all her or his choices. A pious woman in her late 50s, a huge fan of phenomenal Turkish telenovela Forbidden Love, Aşk-ı Memnu, claims to be watching the show for pointing to disasters of degenerated Western conspicuous lifestyles. When we go deeper, she, in quotation, confesses how she is fond of the leading lady and how she loves the mansion they live in, costumes, etc. In other words, a closer look shows how mainstream popular cultural symbols can provide a symbolic universe for different sections of society. In our interview with sociologist Tayfun Atay, he summarized the issue by saying that popular culture loves the secular. I partly agree with Atay. He is right in noting that religious conservative sections of society became more and more affiliated with popular culture and consumer culture. But in my opinion, this does not necessarily bring an unproblematic secularization for their part. In my opinion, there is also a theoretical problem in Atay's assessment. We are talking about religiosity and secularity as two distinct, essentialist and unproblematic concepts, and we are trying to read the history as a zero-sum game between the two. This is not the case for me. As our case points out, I just only 2 minutes here. As our case points, what we face is the emergence of hybrid formats in which both tendencies are intertwined and articulated, forming a complex cultural and social structure. Atay is right in noting that a separate Islamic cultural field is in decline, and Islamic popular culture is being absorbed by the mainstream popular culture. However, this absorption does not end up with secularization of Islam and or decrease in importance of Islam as a social and cultural reference point. However, more complicated and intricate answers to this complex relational whole could only be given by focusing on media practices and their role in reconfiguration of nation, culture, community, and history. Next week, I will be in a Korea meeting in Prague, and I will be trying to discuss this issue with a specific reference to historical Turkish series Resurrection Ertuğrul Diriliş. What we must do, by Schultz's words, is to move beyond the contrast between superficial mass culture and authentic religion by exploring the mutually constitutive relationship between individual religiosity, enterprise, and consumption in the contemporary moment. End of quote. For not losing time, I didn't even drink my water.
30 seconds to spare. Thank you very much. So, I'd like to thank Burak for his speedy presentation and invite Kamran to come and speak to us about media and the globalization of a new rhetoric against terrorism and political Islam. So thank you and welcome.
First of all, I thank Aḥmad University for this conference and for my opportunity to speak here. And I'm an early alumnus of this institute, and it's given me an added pleasure. And my further pleasure is expanded by my seeing some of my faculty members here. So my research as a historian is basically focused on the 18th and 19th century British India and British India. And I study Islam through the Quran, commentaries of the Quran, and the religious texts like the biographies of Prophet Muhammad. But today I'll be speaking on modern contemporary Islam, because I continue to think about contemporary Islam with the lens of history and with the past events, so that we can better understand that. And this also reminds me a little bit brief conversation last night with Professor Jamal Alias about the possibility of applying theory sophisticatedly to contemporary Islam as compared to a classical medieval Islam. So, my paper deals with a larger question of how public intellectuals in Muslim contexts interact with their publics through different forms of media, and how this engagement has an impact on their message in terms of their choice of what to communicate and how to communicate. But more importantly, the paper discusses how this contact or interaction with the public has a direct impact on the nature of academic knowledge that we build about intellectuals in Muslim contexts, and we place them in different categories such as traditionalists and modernists and fundamentalists. So I'll be discussing these aspects through the case of a well-known Pakistani scholar, Jāved Aḥmad Ghāmidī, born in 1951, and his public communication of a counter-narrative against political Islam. So first we give it a brief look at who Jāved Ghāmidī is. So born in 1951, Ghāmidī received both traditional education in Islamic sciences and also modern university education that ended up in his earning degrees in English literature and philosophy from the university in Lahore. And in his early 20s, he also studied the Quran for many years under the tutelage of the famous Quran commentator Amin Ahsan Islahi, who was born in 1903 and died in 1997. In the light of Ghāmidī's academic and learning and his study and analysis of Muslim scholarly tradition, he ended up thinking that education and research are the primary means to Muslim reform, and therefore established through the support of larger outside funding an Institute of Islamic Research back in 1983 under the name Al-Mawlid in Lahore. That was aimed at to initiate an ihya, the revival of Islamic learning. However, despite the Institute's aims and programs of research, it remained a center for the propagation of Ghāmidī's own ideas. The formal educational programs could not develop, and the focus of its board of governors was main center on the spread of Ghāmidī's thoughts. This latter strategy, however, was successful, and at the turn of this 20th century, Ghāmidī had acquired a strong media presence, not only in Pakistan but also in other parts of the world. Ghāmidī's understanding of jihad was also in strong disagreement with that of Taliban in Pakistan and Afghanistan. His opposition to Taliban resulted in Taliban's attacks on his institute and his home, and ultimately this finally led to his migration to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, somewhere in 2008 and 2009. However, he remained connected strongly, or rather stronger than ever, with Pakistan through media, which seems to have a particular interest in promoting his ideas and thoughts. So all of the major media channels air his talk shows and his talks on religious matters and religious issues. More importantly, he started expanding his network through establishing country chapters of his institute and his global dawah programs in Australia, UK, United States, Canada, India, and also elsewhere. His institute has now been practically turned into a dawah organization, although theoretically they still aim to establish it on a more research grounds. And I'll touch upon this issue, that what I'm trying to say, that by stopping this act of establishing a research institute, how it suffered, how the Ghāmidī's own work suffered because of that. His work is essentially focused on the study of the Quran and on Sunnah, which in Ghāmidī's thought is not equivalent to Hadith, the prophetic saying. So Sunnah is in Ghāmidī's thought is different, which we are not touching in this talk. Two of his major works are Mizan, which is a work on hermeneutical and legal theory, and Al-Bayan is the second work, which is a Quran commentary, which has been written on the principle of coherence of the Quran. So I will not delve on this topic, but I'll talk about the counter-narrative, which basically his theory about the relationship between Islam and nation state, which he offers against Taliban, ISIS, and also the traditional schools of thought around the world, in South Asia and also around the world, and which he has occasioned, and that is occasioned because of his writings in the public press now, that has occasioned an intense debate in Pakistan, and all the traditional schools and traditionalist schools are agitating against him, and the circles affected by it in both print and other forms of media. So, in contrast to counter-narrative, first he tries to identify what is the traditionalist narrative, or what is the traditional narrative about this relationship between state and Islam. So, seeing the jihadi proclamations by Taliban and IS and their diplomatic rebuttal by the traditionalist schools, Ghāmidī attempts to discover what has been the intellectual stance on jihad and the related issues in the whole Muslim scholarly tradition. So to him, the Muslim scholarly tradition presents a universal common thread on these issues, as we read this in Quran commentaries, in jurisprudence and Islamic political theory. So therefore, despite the traditionalist schools disowning of Taliban and IS positions, Ghāmidī contends that their own views, these traditionalist views on jihad and the establishment of an Islamic order are in line with these and other militant groups. He begins by identifying the foundations of these traditionalist thought on the relationship between Islam and the state. So 4 terms are important in what he identifies, that 4 Islamic terms, or the 4 religious terms. So first is the shirk, which is means is ascribing partners with Allah, and kufr, which means rejecting Prophet Muhammad and his message, and irtidad is the 3rd term, which means apostasy or renegating from Islam, and finally the jihad. So he argues that Muslim tradition is unanimous in seeing these sins and practices as worthy of intervention by state and individuals. So what he's trying to say that Taliban, ISIS and traditionalist schools, for all of them, intervening in the lives of others based upon these thinking about these terms, religious terms, they are authorized to interfere in the life of other people. So this has resulted in the development of a political Islam. So he argues, so whoever holds any opinion tantamount to these things can be punished by the Muslim society. In addition to these three concepts, he finds that in case of jihad, it has been understood more for establishing an Islamic order and overcoming kufr worldwide, not only in the contemporary times, but throughout the Muslim scholarly tradition. Here his approach is not to argue for a theoretical and practical continuity in the Muslim scholarly thought. What he studied is the textual sources, mostly legal, exegetical and critical theory, and where Muslim scholars have been offering their verdict in unanimity. So let's have a quick look at his own narrative against this traditionalist narrative, which he identifies. He is the Jāved Ghāmidī, and here we have even the programs on media programs are named after him. On the titles are based on his name, and they were popular programs. And he is also visiting the United States and other countries, and these are his lectures which is given on the traditionalist Islam and the counter narrative. So first of all, he has 10 points on the counter narrative. There is no such thing as a state religion. Islam's message is essentially directed towards an individual Muslim. Creating a world Islamic state of Muslim countries can be a political need, but it is not a religious requirement for Muslims or their leaders. The basis of a Muslim nation is not Islam but brotherhood. A Muslim cannot be termed non-Muslim for any radical beliefs as long as he identifies himself as Muslim. Radical beliefs like they are beliefs against beliefs like shirk or beliefs tantamount to kufr. And so no person or state can punish another person for committing sins like shirk, kufr and irtidad, which I have explained. Jihad is a state prerogative and it can be only undertaken for defense or against injustice, not to spread Islam. Jihad is undertaken against combatants only, not non-combatants. So political system of Muslims is based on amruhum shura bainahum. This is an Arabic phrase which means the political system of Muslims is based on consultation or a more democratic system rather than a military or dictatorial system. So, but it also, so the implementation of Sharia, in his opinion, is a wrong term. So instead, we should be asking to the leaders of a government, leaders of a Muslim state, asking them or advising them or requesting them to practice Islam injunctions as Muslim leaders, as leaders. So they have no, there is no asking that they should implement it. Whatever few of the jobs they have to do, they should do it rather than forcing them. So these, what is expected of a Muslim religious leaders is that treat all the citizens as equal citizens. So they, as leaders, are not different from the ordinary citizens. So governments organizing of the weekly Friday prayers and Eid prayers annually. And there should be a department for Hisbah. Like Hisbah is an Arabic term for meaning commanding right and forbidding wrong in the society, in large society. So even justice in the case of enemies. So wherever the case is against enemies, we should be just to them. And capital punishment only for murder and fasad fil ard. Fasad is a wider chaos in the society, or wider, larger public crimes. So Islamic message to be promoted worldwide as a government level. That he identifies. And his final point is, if Muslim government does not follow these injunctions, only advising them, we can only advise them rather than, we should not take up their function and implement the Islam on the society as such. So this is the basic counter narrative which he offers. So my objective of doing that is not this basically familiarizing yourself with the counter narrative. My point is that what has really happened or happens when a scholar becomes a public intellectual. What is achieved and what is lost. So I'm more interested, I'm more laments on what is lost in that case when a person like Ghāmidī interacts with the media, with the larger public, and that's all. So when I read academic discourse on public intellectuals, there are many similar things echoed in the case of Ghāmidī and his public engagement. So there are 3 points which I want to highlight. The first is, it results in the simplification of the complexity of the argument which he tries to make through wider, larger public. For Ghāmidī, one of the foremost responsibilities as a Muslim intellectual is to guide his audience, not to enter into a scholarly discourse, not to enter into a scholarly discussion. But his guidance happens in practice through a process of simplification of hidden complexity involved in the understanding of Muslim textual sources. Therefore, despite his intention to the otherwise, that despite his intention based upon his programs of establishing an institute, despite his intentions to enter into a scholarly discourse, his presentation results in an emphasis on the continuity of Muslim thought and practice on these topics like ijtihad, like jihad, and polytheism and kufr. For instance, in his public message, he is not able to discuss the historicization involved in these textual sources and the pragmatic appropriations done by Muslim readers throughout the Muslim history related to the study of the text. And my second point, apart from the simplification problem, is the public intellectuals and how their work is shaped by public expectations. So in addition to this simplification, Ghāmidī is trapped by his diverse public expectations of guidance on all matters, including humanities and social sciences. So when they stand before a larger public as religious scholars, so they cannot just talk about only on the religious text, on religious matters. They are expected to be a larger scholars talking about everything to guide people. So this results in its unintended generalizations. Because I stress on unintended because this is not his intention when you talk to him in person at the back of his office. So this results in his unintended generalizations about modern nation state, about the nature of law, and about history in general. And this list does not stop here. It extends to the generalizations in the disciplines of psychology, natural sciences, society, and anthropology. What I'm trying to say is that he is talking on everything. So he begins to guide people on Islam and its history, but he ends up talking about everything on which a specialist knowledge is required. So, seeing this kind of becoming of a public intellectual, I was talking to an established scholar, a secular, non-Muslim academic scholar in the academy, who remained all his life throughout focused on particular themes, not entering into a larger public engagement. So on one occasion when I was urging an academic scholar who always emphasized on the specialist knowledge to engage with the larger public, he opined that as public intellectuals, we are expected to talk on those matters on which we have limited knowledge. So I won't be able to do that despite my university always asking me to do that, to present at the larger topics. My third point, seeing this case of media and counter-narrative and its engagement throughout his life, Ghāmidī's engagement throughout his life with the public. My third point is related to the academic study of Muslim intellectuals and academic study of Islam in the modern times. This impact of media is not limited to public intellectuals and their publics. It extends as well to us as academic observers in the secular academy who study modern Islam. Some of the very categories through which we understand Islam in modern times is partly based on these public discourses of simplification. That is, the discourses of the so-called modernist Ghāmidī and the traditionalists such as the Deobandi schools in South Asia and in other parts of the world. So my own research on modern religious texts coming from the 18th and 19th century, such as commentaries and the biographies of the Prophet, and my own study of these public discourses, the contemporary discourses, such as the discourse of counter-narrative, all these point to the inadequate nature of these categories through which we understand them in this era. Thus the category of traditionalist is taken superficially taken to mean and then utilized in the academic discourse is to mean the one who emphasizes on Muslim tradition, and by contrast, a modernist is someone whose frame of reference is the modern society and the challenges of the modern hegemonic discourses. But these categories sideline the very processes of simplification and the polemics involved in the development of particular perceptions about religious scholars. It reminds me of a particular anecdote related to such a religious scholar whom I was talking. When I asked one of such modernists that you are categorized in such a way by us as academics, he reminded me of since he was a student of larger Western philosophy as well, he reminded me of the French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault's famous quote, which in itself is open to many interpretations. So Foucault says, no doubt I'm not the only one who writes in order to have no face. Do not ask me who I am, and do not ask me to remain the same. Leave it to our bureaucrats and our police to see that our papers are in order. At least spare us their morality when we write. End of quote. So what I'm trying to say as a finishing argument is that Ghāmidī remains an obscure figure as far as the complexity of his academic arguments are concerned, due to his media and public engagements as public intellectuals. So whenever I read discourses on Ghāmidī, because I continuously follow academic discourses, university secular academic discourses about Ghāmidī, that how they are understanding him. So they are understanding him through his public discourses, through his polemics, but they never reach down to his core argument, what he's trying to say. And that core argument is not even written in the books in which he has published, because those books are also for the larger public, which only mentions the arguments in a very broad, superficial manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I think we've got a lot of time for questions, so could I invite you all to pose questions to our panelists, please? Come on, there has to be questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question for Burak. So I'm very interested in how in discourses that define themselves as Islamic, television has moved from something that the pious thing was to separate yourself, disassociate yourself, perform non-watching television, to performing piety while watching certain kinds of television. And I'm wondering how that arc manifested itself in Turkey. If you agree that such a thing did happen.
Can I get the game? What?
Yeah, so we had a period where watching television was defined as un-Islamic, to a period where watching certain kinds of television is considered pious.
Yeah.
Could you tell me a little bit about, were there important thresholds, important moments in that trajectory in Turkish discourses about television?
I'll try to note down with a couple of sentences, but I'm trying to understand and trying to explain this when I'm writing this. But this is not only about television, but it's nearly all about other fields of cultural production and cultural performance at the same time. This is also going for economic activities, about political activities throughout the 1980s. You know, Islamists are beginning to discuss in Turkey these issues deeply. You know, what is going to be our relationship with economics, what is going to be our relationship with radio, media, and all other stuff. But this transformation is a part of an overall transformation, whether we will be a force within other forces. Are we going to run for elections? Are we going to be in legal political action? These were being discussed by these circles. For instance, in 1994, all these developments are interrelated, and they are filling up the gaps in a puzzle. In 1994, it was the first time that in local elections that the Islamist party, Welfare Party, is winning the post in Ankara, in Istanbul, and it was being discussed by many Islamist circles. You know, is it legitimate to run for mayorship? Is it legitimate to run for general elections? this transformation, in my opinion, is it will be a bit deterministic and reductionist, we may say, but it's all about the changing socio-economic and social basis of Islamism in Turkey. I just try to tell some minor things about it. The class composition of Islamists are changing. Islamists are getting more. Islamic sections of society are getting more and more involved with economic activity. There is a demographic change in Turkey at the same time. The population is changing. The new generations of Islamists are being more and well educated. They are entering into universities. A new Islamist intelligentsia is being born in throughout. I think when we consider all these developments together, we are seeing a new section, a huge section of a considerable section of population who does not want to be behind all these developments. And this course is changing. In my PhD thesis, I have studied, in fact, the ideological elements of this course. There are publications being published about the rise of Islamist economics. There is İktisat ve İş Dünyası, economics and business world. In that publication, for instance, a bunch of academics and intellectuals they are trying to legitimize how Islam and capitalism can go well together. They are going to Medina vesikası or to many other ancient documents, and they are trying to rewrite history. They are trying to reinterpret the religious injunctions. In my opinion, this transformation is also deep related with that. Becoming more urbanized, becoming more capitalized, becoming more and more within the light. I think it's all deeply related with that.
Another question? I have a question.
I do apologize if I missed Claire's presentation about the sexual misery of Muslims, but I'm very interested to ask you about the analogy, the dialectic between sexuality as a discourse and sexuality as a biologically dictated element. And I keep wondering when I'm thinking from the Foucauldian power relationship, which is actually the point of departure for you? Is that the objectivity of sexuality as a topic in which you depend on, or that at the discursive level of dominant discourse and resistant or counter discourse?
Right, thank you. It's a tough one. And I guess that I'm starting with representations very much, so I guess it's the discourse side of things. But what is interesting is that in the longer work from which my paper is extracted, there was a section on homosexuality, because although I ended in the presentation that I don't think you managed to see, it ends with Shalina Zahra Jan Muhammad set up as a kind of more complex figure compared with sort of happy British Muslims, and then the sort of camel dowd sexual misery. So I was trying to find a way through that binary, and I ended with Shalina Zahra Jan Muhammad, but still that's not the end of the story, because I would argue that one of the lacunae in her work is homosexuality. So in her new book, Generation M, she interviews a real rich range of Muslims, but not a single openly gay Muslim, and she just once very briefly mentions the Orlando killing, which had just happened when the book was going to press, and she condemns it. But I would have to show you the sentence or two in which she discusses that, which is slightly ambiguous, to say the least. So then, in the longer paper, I go on to look at some other writers who've taken on this whole question of whether sexuality is biological or it's a sort of nature-nurture kind of question. And I'm quite interested in Amjad Kabil's book, Straightening Alley, which is the only, to my knowledge, book by novel by an openly gay Muslim in Britain. I might be wrong, but I think that's the only one. And so I look at that in some detail. It's got its own flaws, but it does give us another angle. So I would have liked to talk about more writers than just Jan Muhammad. I also looked at Aisha Malik, whose new book, Sophia Khan Is Not Obliged, is a chick lit, really interesting. Another story about meeting the one, through internet dating and so forth. And in that, the character meets a young, really handsome guy she calls Hottie, but she realises she meets him outside Heaven, the nightclub, and realises he's gay. And there's quite a lot of play with, like, she misunderstood that he was going to heaven and it was a spiritual conversation, but actually he's a gay Muslim. So but that's just in the margins of the text. So the only one I found which is at the forefront is Straightening Alley. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but that's where I was going with that in the paper.
You might follow up a conversation later. So we have a question back here and then at the front.
So actually mine is a follow-up to that one, which is, and this is complete ignorance of this literature, and I'm just wondering, do the people you're looking at, do they actually locate themselves in a global Islamic experience, or is it very much a British experience? Because I'm struck by the fact, or the observation, that, well, of course there are gay groups. There are gay groups in Muslim majority countries, there are gay groups all across North America, Muslim gay groups. There are other ways people meet. A lot of these sort of problems and discourses occur differently, perhaps, in other contexts. And I just wonder if it gets located that way. I would just, again, the sort of the narrative of, well, repressed versus whatever, healthily sexual, or what do you want to call it? No, or actually sexual. Well, but isn't the control of women based in the notion that they have active sexualities that need controlling? So I'm just, and these things are discussed in other contexts. I'm just wondering if they're related.
Okay. Well, this question of do the people I'm looking at locate themselves in a British or in an international context is an interesting one, and I think it's probably a bit similar to this Foucault point about, don't ask me who I am and don't ask me to stay who I am, because Shalini Zara John Muhammad, I would say Love in a Headscarf is really quite a British text, but Generation M is hugely global. It's got a lot about branding. She very deliberately makes sure that she looks at Muslims in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Turkey, in Pakistan. She herself is from a Gujarati East African background. She looks at Muslims in Britain, in the US, in Canada, pretty much everywhere. She's interested in converts. She's, that's why I think it's interesting that in all this multiplicity, gay and lesbians are absent. I think the happy British Muslims, they called themselves happy British Muslims, and I think that was quintessentially British because of the kind of locations that they used, the clothes, the kind of cool that they were putting across. It's quite different from the Mipster phenomenon, which is a much more US phenomenon. The interesting one is the Kabyle book that I mentioned in answer to this question. That's very British in my opinion, and specifically Birmingham, Kashmiri community, and yet he couldn't seem to find a publisher in Britain, so it's published in the US. And there's a glossary of, which seems slightly patronising, I think, for an audience quite comfortable with British Asian fiction. There's no need to explain what dal and pakoras are, but that's what they've done. So it's at once very British and very international.
Thank you. One here. Thank you.
Can I ask Kamran a question? In terms of this, Ghāmidī's counter-narrative, is he actually countering some of the traditional political Islam which was espoused by Maududi and people like that? Did you do any comparison with Maududi's work? And the second point was, in the context of Pakistan particularly, is there another factor at play, which is the level of poverty and how some of the not political Islam but the Islamic narratives have been pushed through the madrasas and so on, either internally or externally, to give access to some of the younger people who probably didn't have money to put food on the table, that kind of thing.
Yeah, both of your questions are related.
Yeah.
So first of all, what he's condemning, or not condemning, but what he's trying to say is that the Muslim tradition, scholarly tradition, the ideas of the older generations,
yes,
like the 15th century or even prior to that, those ideas on jihad, for instance, and the ideas of today's major schools of traditional schools of thought are the same on those matters, that whether we should expand our empire or not, whether we should expand our territories to make a global empire or not. So they are the same arguments throughout the centuries. But those arguments were in the Muslim tradition were scattered here and there in different sources. What he says is that it was Maududi in the early part of the 20th century who gave those ideas a coherent look, which ultimately resulted in a form of political Islam, militant Islam. Gradually it turned out to be a political Islam. So what he's saying is that when those traditionalist schools, other than the militant schools, when they are seen as opposing Taliban and IS, so they are not opposing them in theory. In principle, they are not opposing them. They are just opposing them strategically. That our route to London ISMC can be many routes. So Taliban's route is a wrong route, but ultimately our destination is London. So Taliban and IS has chosen a different wrong route whereby they are spreading bloodshed and all that kind of things. We are against that. This is not the time to do that, or probably their time is not. Although we have to reach London, but this is not the right time to reach London. So let's stop for some time. But because of the universal common thread throughout the civilization, throughout the Muslim history, what he says, throughout the history, those ideas are common. So there is always a possibility of the development of political Islam, which has happened. Regarding this poverty, what he says is that it is an added argument. So definitely the other factors have aggravated the rise of the political Islam, the international scenarios, the policies of the international powers, and the economic factors. They have all contributed to the emergence of political Islam. But the underlying religious thread is, to him, it is a dominating factor. But it was there. Thanks.
Yeah, I have a question, actually, and a comment for Claire. So, one of the things that I was thinking about as you were explaining, as you were your paper. So we have on the one hand, first, Muslim men as sort of oppressors of Muslim women's sexuality. But one of the things that I've noticed that's been an ongoing process, but that over the last few years seem to have that this category is no longer sort of the primary category. The primary category are Muslim men as a threat to white women. We've seen all the coverage, the sensational coverage of immigration in Germany and France about this, but also in the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, where there were the two narratives. So there was the young man as a terrorist, as the Muslim terrorist, and there was another narrative that was really struggling to get aired, which is he was a young gay Muslim man who was doing this because of that, right? So the terror narrative was used to suppress the other narrative, as if Muslims can't be gay, they can only be terrorists. So I thought that was a very interesting thing in the coverage. The comment, the other thing that I wanted to mention, I don't know if you're familiar with the sort of Saudi women erotic novel category, where it's neither misery nor happiness, but it's sort of grappling with modern life, right? Women's sexuality as and having sexual satisfaction and happiness as part of life. So it's a complete sort of demystification of it. It's neither this nor that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. That's really thoughtful, and we're revising this, so I need to take that forward. I think that you've made me think a lot, because there's like the old Spivak chestnut about brown men and white men saving brown women from brown men. What you're saying is that there's a turn, and it's back to almost like at 1857, if we, because I specialise in South Asia, the kind of post-rebellion narrative of like white women being ravished and how terrible that was.
And it's a race narrative.
And it's a race narrative, and then this extra layering with the Orlando thing is something I really need to think about. So that's brilliant. Thank you. Then regarding the Saudi erotic novel, I mean, I'm aware of literary fiction like No Sex in the City. Yeah. Is that what you're talking about? Or you mean manuals?
There's not the manuals. The novels. Novels typically written by women. Yeah. Typically who are sort of amateur novelists. Yeah. Right. They're dentists or coders during the day, and they write these novels at night. So like not Vanity, many of them are commercial publishers. I mean, not many, I know of 3 or 4, but apparently there are many more.
Ghana is from Riyadh, maybe one of them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
Riyadh
yeah.
is one of the most famous.
So we have another question
Yeah.
in the back, and then second row, please.
I think I'm asking a lot of questions for today, just which is interesting. Burak, I have a question for you, please. Just how democratic, liberating in that Turkey has more than one discourse that can be called Islamist or Muslim discourse. I'm coming from Egypt, where we have the ideological state apparatus thinking from Arthurian perspective, facing the Muslim Brotherhood, which is another Islamist discourse. In Turkey, you end up having more than one layer of discourse. The Fethullah Gulen one, you have the Erdogan one, the AKP one. How liberating and democratic this multiplicity of discourse in Turkey, despite all the negativity that you have in your paper?
Really good question. I think it's a really hard question at the same time. You know, it's for the last, when you look at the course of events in the last months, my personal opinion will be a struggle between equally authoritarian and limiting discourses, I can say. You know, my answer to this will be, you know, this was a zero-sum game, and this was a game that the liberal democratic forces will eventually lose, you know, and they are losing at the same time, unfortunately, because, you know, your question is, you know, specifically if it's about the two forces now at the moment who are fighting for that. The coup attempt, if it was successful, it would have been a disaster. I genuinely think that, you know, it would have been a disaster because, you know, a secret and unknown force is going to take the whole state apparatus. You know. But things did not end in a liberal democratic way after the coup. That's the fact that you're living every day. Now we're talking about media, television. Now the STV has been shut down many months ago before the coup attempt. 2 or 3 days ago, you've seen newspapers were, you know, many Kurdish newspapers or Cumhuriyet newspapers most recently has been shut down. In that sense, you know, in my opinion, we are not in a position to choose one of the discourses over other. But if you ask my preference, I always prefer a you know, political party over an unknown organization, because I don't know the other side of the story. At least, you know, it's authoritarian, but at least I know it's a political party. You know, I would always choose a political party, but this is not choosing between more liberal, more authoritarian forces. So I hope this.
Okay, thank you. Go to the next question.
Yes, this is not a question, but perhaps a struggle to formulate a question. And that is, we have here, we have mentioned individuals in particular countries. And I was just wondering, perhaps if you take Ghāmidī, and if you take Jan Muhammad, what is common between them that actually, because they're all, both of them are struggling to achieve something, and there is Islam in the background. And perhaps if you take your two authors in Turkey, same thing. There is perhaps I'm calling for what I'm requesting. Perhaps is a sort of a comparative way of arriving at something that is common to two or three of you. As I said, this is not a question.
we consult each other and then.
It might be a discussion point after.
Well, I mean, from Jan Muhammad, from the point of view of Jan Muhammad, a lot of what you were saying did actually strike the chord, because you know, this idea of engaging with modernity is very much the point that she wants to put across in Generation. And about especially the issue of branding, because actually the publisher and the person who, the copyright owner is, I was surprised at the front of the book, it's not Shalina John Muhammad, it's actually Ogilvy something, this company that she works for, that some of you will know. It's like, and they're trying to market and see that the Muslim pound is a very big business. And so, you know, the chapters, she's interested in how young Muslims meet their partners, she's interested in their clothes and their modest fashion, and she's interested in music, and she has a chapter for those. I know there was a couple on comics that in other panels, so she's got a chapter on that. She's interested in literature, so she treads on wide turf, not very well in my opinion, but anyway. You know, she does a really interesting job of looking at Muslims engaging with modernity but still just staying true to her faith. So I could actually see quite a lot of conflict between what we were both saying, although in some ways they seem so far apart.
I think they are engaging with the question of what is authentic Islam today, and who has the authority to say something like that. So since they are trying to, so Ghāmidī is basically again forming his ideas on the formative period of Islam, or on the classical sources, like the religious sources, and trying to avoid the whole tradition of what it has been written about. So he's trying to create authentic Islam through the founding moments of Islam. But his problem is the modernity, that how to present it as an authentic Islam. So his counter narrative is an authentic Islam in his right.
Did you want to comment?
I think, you know, the issue with authenticism is so interesting. This is a story going in Turkey at the same time. Who is going to represent the most authentic Islam? And it's getting harder and harder for anyone to represent the authentic Islam. You know, this is a story. Maybe what Claire was telling. I can also provide you many examples from Turkey about the happy Muslims in Turkey. You know, but again, the story is partly coming and in a way tying up to the story about consumer culture. You know, the story of happy Muslims is at the same time the story of consumer culture we have. I can just send you some links of there is Moda Nisa in Turkey, and the sexually vibrant Muslim women are getting so happier and happier, and what they're consuming is headscarves, you know, and wearing the basic slogan of that company is actually it was something like happiness, you know. You don't need to be sad, miserable, or bad looking in order to be a Muslim. You can be vibrant, sexually energetic, but stay Muslim at the same time. You know, but this is at the same time deeply related with the transformation of broadcasting in Turkey. You can stay Muslim, but you can also enjoy life. You can also enjoy, but you can also stay authentic at the same time. You know,
being happy Muslim is an authentic.
Exactly, yeah. But this brings us to the issue with Derrida and Mattimo on religion. They say that, you know, religion has always been mediatized, you know, from the beginning. There is no authentic Islam or authentic Christianity or authentic religion as such. Always the ideology of authenticity itself is per se an ideology. You know, there is no such thing as authentic something. You know, there is always an addition, a supplement, and that supplement is what gives the thing its characteristic. So it's a futile attempt to search for an authentic Islam at the same time, and this is what we're experiencing. But in these times, you're experiencing it so fast and in an unprecedented speed and velocity and all this. Yeah.
So do we have any more questions? I think we respond by saying thank you very much.